Final Fantasy VI versus Final Fantasy VII. Okay guys, let's start a forest fire. I'm pitting the two most popular games in this franchise against each other. I choose to do this now because I've recently played both of these games, and I feel like I can do a fair assessment of them. As you can see from my previous videos, I actually do like both of these games. And I think they're both masterpieces, but in their own ways. However, if I had to choose one, which one would I choose? Will I crumble under the pressure from you fanboys and fangirls? Or will I stay true to my beliefs and just tell you guys straight up which game I think is better? Let's find out. To answer this, I will judge the two games from the same three categories I use in my other videos. Namely, story and plot, characters and growth, as well as gameplay and combat. And as always, there will be spoilers. Before I pit these games against each other, I would like to start off by naming three things that I really like about each of the games. Starting off with Final Fantasy VI. The first thing I would like to mention with Final Fantasy VI is the way they tell the story without overcomplicating things. FF6 is a brilliant game following a brilliant story with an easy concept of good versus evil. The Empire is evil and those opposing it are good. This by itself might be looked at as a thin concept, but Final Fantasy VI is nailing each part since it never leaves any questions on what's going on. The second thing about Final Fantasy VI I would like to mention is the uniqueness of each character in the game, both in and out of combat. Final Fantasy VI has a great cast of characters that all stand out from each other, both personality-wise and gameplay-wise. And even if some characters are better written than others, they are still brilliantly made. Each character has their own playstyle, making the game very fun to experiment with. Lastly, my third point will be the humor. The last point I would like to lift is the great balance between humor and seriousness in the storytelling. By this I mean that the humor, even if at times extreme and goofy, never interfere with the dark story that is Final Fantasy VI. A great example here is how a character like Ultros can thrive in the story, even though he's a big comical relief. Another example is how characters like Locke and Edward can drop one-liners at any place without hurting the feeling of immersion. Amazing. Going on with Final Fantasy VII. Final Fantasy VII's first point is how great of a cast they have, and how they have stepped up the dialogue between them from previous installments to flesh out the characters even more. This gives you the opportunity to learn more about each character, and it feels like you know them a lot better than from previous games. The second point is how the characters grow throughout the game. The characters aren't always right. They grow throughout the game to become greater than when they started. This is a very human thing, and it makes it really easy to connect to each character. I would also like to mention that each character arc have great character development, except maybe Yuffie's. And to be fair, Yuffie is just a child trying to carry the burden of her people without losing face. Thirdly, the last point I would like to make about Final Fantasy VII is how good they are at pacing the game. The game keeps a great pacing in its storytelling, and it managed to keep it throughout the game. Never do you feel the story loses its hold on you as it pushes you from one place to the other. This is, in my opinion, the only reason the plot of the game works, since the story can be quite confusing at times, to say the least. And there we have it. Now I have shown you guys that I don't hate on any of the games, and let's put these two Final Fantasy heavyweights against each other. However, before we start the breakdown, feel free to like the video to help me with the algorithm. Now let's start the breakdown off with my first point, story and plot. In this category we have one simple, well-written plot that totally loses its pacing towards the end in Final Fantasy VI, pitted against a convoluted mess with a great pacing called Final Fantasy VII. Both games are strong where the other is weak. Final Fantasy VI juggles the key moments of the story in a masterful way, and it managed to deliver a masterful story even without having a true main protagonist. Instead, the driving force of the story is event-focused, and Final Fantasy VI just keep delivering each great moment after another. Final Fantasy VII's plot, on the other hand, is more character-driven. By that, I mean they have fewer characters that push the plot directly, and that most of the game get pushed either by Sephiroth or Aerith, while the main character Cloud don't even know who is. I will admit that many of the characters in Final Fantasy VII still have roles that are very important to the plot, but where Final Fantasy VI shine is that the story would be solid even if you change a lot of characters out, while Final Fantasy VII stands and falls with the characters. Where Final Fantasy VII have a chance on catching up is in the world of Ruin, which is a total pace killer. To sum it up, at this part of the game Kefka has already won and no one cares about anything anymore. The point here is for the player to discover hope in a broken world, but since this part of the plot lacks any true stress factor, it is really hard to feel engaged in the story. Final Fantasy VII, on the other hand, has a clean pace throughout the game, and it always keeps up the urgency in what you're doing while you are still managing to discover backstories and discover the world. To summarize this segment, I do say that even if Final Fantasy VII was my favorite game growing up, the plot is inferior to the one of Final Fantasy VI. The pace drop is but a smaller speed bump compared to all the twists and turns in Final Fantasy VII, which at some moments seem to do everything they can to confuse the player. This category goes to Final Fantasy VI. Jumping over to characters and growth, we have two games with two great casts of characters. Both of the games have great backstories surrounding the characters, and both of the games have great dialogues. How I look at it is that Final Fantasy VI has the plot pushing the characters, while Final Fantasy VII has characters pushing the plot. Final Fantasy VI is a very dark game, and most characters are fighting tragedies from their past. These are constantly brought forward in a beautiful way, and it shapes each character. The game also does a great job in closing these story arcs, and by the end of the game, most characters have found peace within themselves. Final Fantasy VII is almost as dark, and its 2 is full of tragedy that shape the characters. The game doesn't have as many prominent characters as Final Fantasy VI, but instead has a variety of cast filling smaller roles, while the main character Cloud stands for most of the story time together with Aerith, Sephiroth, as well as Tifa later in the game. What makes Final Fantasy VII's characters great instead lies in the moral dilemma of each character. They all have very flawed personalities, and they grow throughout the game, not to find peace, but to find a reason to forgive and live on. We also need to take a look at the antagonists. Between the two big bats, Kefka is the more fleshed out one if we stay within the main game. However, Final Fantasy VII has so many other antagonists to fill different roles, that Sephiroth can get away with being a powerful mind ghost of Cloud, who always seems to know far more than everyone else. The rest of the roles are filled with different villains, and it keeps the story interesting as well as less predictable. Coming to the conclusion in this segment, I personally favor Final Fantasy VII. Even though they have less prominent characters, they also have less bad characters. And the part that I feel really makes the difference to me is how the characters grow. Somehow, it just feels far more realistic to me that characters striving for growth rather than striving for peace. With this I mean that each character in Final Fantasy VI strives for peace within themselves, while in Final Fantasy VII they never reach that point. Instead, they try to find a way to keep on living. And it is a testament to that we always have to constantly keep moving forward, even when things don't turn out as expected. So, we have a 1-1 now. So it all comes down to the last category, this one being gameplay and combat. We have to start this segment off by saying these are both turn-based story-driven games that are slightly aged with random encounters that fill the majority of the battles. Both of them have loads of missables that can be seen as both a positive and a negative, depending on if you would like to play the game multiple times. You can also see that Final Fantasy VII has taken a lot of things from Final Fantasy VI and improved on them, so we also have to take that into account. When it comes to the combat, Final Fantasy VI manages to weave all the character personalities into the way they fight, making each character feel unique to the other, both in playstyle as well as plot-wise. Final Fantasy VII has a bit of this in their limit break system, but it doesn't really stack up to Final Fantasy VI. Instead, they have a very flexible way of customizing the combat in the materia system, making it possible for each character to have any role, which is good fun in itself. When it comes to the combat itself though, you can really feel that FF7 made a lot of improvement, especially to the game difficulty. I don't mean that Final Fantasy VII is a hard game by any means, but that Final Fantasy VI is a very easy game. Another thing is that it always feels cheap when you die in this game. It's due to some bullshit mechanics such as a status change or some BS finishing move, and it never really feels fair. Final Fantasy VII has its share of BS too, but it does outside of a few encounters feel really fair, especially for a new player. FF7 also have 2 super bosses that really challenge you when you're at full power, where you in Final Fantasy VI will steamroll absolutely everything by the end of the game. Something that Final Fantasy VII did not improve was the team battle, where Final Fantasy VI really did a good job in letting you use more of your party. I know it's a hit or miss, but I feel it's sad that no Final Fantasy game developed this any further. When it comes to the minigames, Final Fantasy VII throws in everything but the kitchen sink, but fortunately, most of them are one-time occurrences. The minigames that do matter, however, have good layers to them, and often feel quite fair since they reward you greatly. Final Fantasy VI has a few cool ideas with the Paladin shield as well as the fishing for Cid, but both of them are far worse in gameplay than the idea itself. Another thing that I have to say is that none of the games had a good arena, and it's just plain awful in both of the games. In Final Fantasy VI it's awful because you have to soft reset to win due to your character's random choice of attacks. And in Final Fantasy VII, they force you to fight a bunch of battles with luck-based handicaps, which are far too grindy for its own good. Oh, and don't mention that awful BFR skeleton. If this last category would have been the design of the gameplay rather than the gameplay itself, Final Fantasy VI would have won hands down. However, due to the more fair battles and the actual quality of how fun you have playing the game, Final Fantasy VII takes the win. And there we have it! With a score of 2-1, Final Fantasy VII secures the win over Final Fantasy VI. And it is, in my opinion, the better of the 2 most popular games in the franchise. But did I make any wrong assessments? Do you disagree with my take on the games, and if you did, what should I have valued higher? Please comment and tell me where I'm right or wrong, and if you like this type of content, feel free to drop a subscription and like the video. Hej då!